Hello and welcome to this GCP2 recorded refresher session. My name's Leanne and I'm the Learning and Development Coordinator for Sandwell Children's Safeguarding Partnership. I've worked with children and young people for almost 20 years now in various different roles, including some time as a senior worker within the Strengthening Family Service, where I myself completed a number of GCP2 assessments as well as supporting others to do so. I'm going to be taking you through this recorded refresher training today. Throughout this session, I am to recap the important learning around neglect. We'll recap the assessment tool and how to use it, building confidence in using the tool, and talk about some key resources and where you can find them. So what is neglect? Well, the Department of Health defines neglect as the persistent failure to meet a child's physical and/or emotional needs likely to result in serious impairment of the child's health or development. It may involve a parent or carer failing to provide adequate food, shelter, clothing, or failing to protect a child from physical harm or danger, or the failure to ensure access to appropriate medical care or treatment. Notice that word persistent. That means that it's not just a one-off incident, but is something that happens over time. They also include neglect of or unresponsiveness to a child's basic emotional needs. Emotional neglect is often missed and is something that we all need to be aware of and alert to, and we need to be offering support where it's been identified. So why should we focus on child neglect? Well, child neglect is the most common reason for a child to be subject to a child protection plan. In 80% of serious case reviews or child safeguarding practice reviews where a child has been significantly hurt or died. The most common concern for which adults contact the NSPCC helpline when they're concerned about a child or young person. The most prevalent form of child maltreatment in the UK. Neglect is a priority area for Sandwell, where we've seen a number of child deaths where neglect has been a contributing factor, and we need to do better. 1 in 10 11 to 17-year-olds report severe neglect, and as you can see on the graph, it is the highest reported concern for children and young people, higher than either physical or sexual abuse. Our principal social worker, Carol Singleton, had this to say when discussing neglect. The early identification of children experiencing neglect is essential. We know that when children are neglected, the impact on them leaves a legacy of issues and problems that they experience and can be carried through to adulthood and their own parenthood. The NSPCC GCP2 neglect tool will help and support practitioners to identify those children experiencing neglect early and put in place short-term interventions that will make a difference to their lives. There are some key documents that you should have already been given as part of your initial GCP2 training. However, if you can't find them or you weren't given them for whatever reason, you can find them in the resources area of the Sandwell Children's Safeguarding Partnership website, which you should already be logged into to access this refresher training. So have a look around for them. We're going to have a look at what those key documents are now. GCP2 handbook. This will help you to identify what it is that you should be looking for in terms of doing your GCP2 assessment. The GCP2 summary book, which talks about the theory and the practice and how they link together when it comes to doing a GCP2 assessment. Parent guides. Now, these are in different languages, and there's a specific section in the SCSP resources around GCP2 that lists all the different language guides that we've got for parent guides. There you've got your assessment tool, which you should be using when completing your graded care profile 2 assessment with families, as it really helps you to identify what it is that you're looking for and score that accordingly. We also have these two key documents that you can also find in the resource area. So there's a blank scoring sheet that you can use when you're completing a GCP2 assessment with a family. And there's also the blank reporting template, because alongside your scoring, you will need to create a report that talks about the scores that you've given, the reason why you've given those scores, and also any factors that are complicating things or supporting the family at this time. So just a reminder that when you are scoring the GCP2 assessment, you are scoring the net care that is being received by the child from the person with caring responsibilities. All too often we miss things, or we kind of give leeway for things where there's extended family member issues, concerns around parents or carers, or whatever it is that's going on in their neighbourhood at the time. However, the GCP2 brings us right back to the care of the child, and is that care good enough? Um, there are, of course, a number of factors that impact that net care, and these should be thought about and discussed as part of the report that goes with the GCP2 assessment and not taken into your assessment scoring. But when you are doing the report, you might want to think about things like the family's socio-familial circumstances. So that's things like, what support networks have they got? How long have they lived in the country, or how long have they lived in the area? What are their finances like? What do they know about the area that they're living in, and what can they access or do they access? We need to think about those other parental attributes, such as their own experiences of being parented or cared for. Is there any drug or alcohol use, or maybe mental health concerns? Has there been, or is there domestic abuse within the home? Or does that parent or caregiver have any learning needs that might need to be understood? We also need to take account for the child's attributes. Now, this could be a child or young person that has maybe some additional needs. They've got a lot of appointments, they've got a lot of additional care needs, the carer is struggling to get their head around everything, or they're just exhausted by it all, which obviously then impacts the quality of the parenting that they're giving. It could be something as simple as a teething child that just isn't sleeping. So because they're not sleeping, the parent or caregiver isn't sleeping, which means again that that caregiver is exhausted and less likely to parent in a positive way. So let's have a recap. What is the Graded Care Profile 2 tool? An evidence-based assessment tool for evaluating levels of parental care. And remember, that's that net care that we just talked about. Uses a graded scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is the best and 5 is the worst, and captures levels of physical and emotional care. Based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, identifies strengths for the family as well as weaknesses, which means you can have some real strength-based conversations around building on what it is that's working well for the family when you're trying to address some of those concerns. It targets different aspects of neglectful care, so it really hones in on what it is that the family is struggling with, and celebrates those strengths and allows you to really target your plans accordingly. Provides evidence that can inform care plans, intervention plans, or requests for additional support for the family. Remember that the Graded Care Profile 2 is a consent-based tool, so it should be completed with families and not done to them. So as we've recapped what the GCP2 tool is, let's just recap what it isn't. So it doesn't replace good professional practice. We shouldn't just be using the GCP2 tool in its singularity. We should be using all of the tools that we have, including just building relationships and rapport with families. It doesn't measure impact, so it tells us about whether the care that the child or young person is receiving is good enough or not, but it doesn't tell us what that's going to mean for that child or young person, because, well, they're all individuals at the end of the day. And it doesn't replace that good relationship building engagement. And finally, it doesn't assess the reason for the neglect. Although that might actually go into your report that will sit alongside the assessment, the scoring of the assessment tool itself doesn't assess the whys and wherefores. that is something to be considered as part of your final report around what is going on for the family and how support can be put in place to address the areas of concern that you've identified. And finally, a reminder of who can complete the Graded Care Profile 2 assessment. Well, anyone and everyone that is working with that child, young person or family and has some concerns around neglectful care, with the consent of that family, can complete the Graded Care Profile 2 assessment with them. If, for example, this professional has limited contact with the family or only has information around a particular section of the Graded Care Profile 2 but feels that it should be completed, they can gain the consent of the family to start that Graded Care Profile 2 with the information that they have with the family, and then pass this on to another professional within the team around that family to continue with that assessment. Now that professional can then do their part and pass it on again, or can then see that Graded Care Profile 2 assessment through to completion, whatever kind of is best for the family, and however that works best for the professionals around that family as well. So just to recap, you don't have to complete the Graded Care Profile 2 tool in its entirety if you don't feel like you're able to. You can just complete small sections of it based on your interactions with the family. So let's remind ourselves of what the GCP2 tool looks like and how it works. So it is broken down into 4 main areas that you can see here: development, physical, emotional and safety. And each of those areas are then broken down into smaller areas that can really focus what it is that you're looking for or thinking about in those sections. As you can see, under development, we've got 4 smaller areas. It asks about acceptance of the child or young person, disapproval, so thinking about behaviour management, approval, so what are those positive interactions that they have, and also stimulation, so how do they do things together, what do they do together, what sort of play is on offer, etc. The physical section is broken down into these smaller areas here. So we think about nutrition. What is a child or young person eating? Is it good enough? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? Is it enough? Is it too much? Etc. We think about housing. So what is the condition of the property in terms of safety, in terms of decorating and layout, etc. It talks about clothing and whether they fit right and stuff, and hygiene, as to whether the child or young person is clean, has access to hygiene products, brushes their teeth, etc. And then we think about health, and then talks about things like attending health appointments, attending follow-up appointments, things like immunisations, going to the dentist, seeking medical attention if needed or if prompted to do so by somebody else. The emotional section is broken down into these 2. So we've got mutual engagement, which is that kind of backwards and forwards, almost conversational, serve and return, it might be called, where children, young people and their parents or caregiver are interacting with each other. And it also talks about that responsiveness. How responsive is the parent or caregiver to that child or young person's emotional needs, and how well do they engage in that? And finally, you've got safety, which is broken down into these 2. So we've got what safety is in place in the carer's presence. So while the carer or parent is there, what safety is there, what rules are put in place, what physical boundaries such as baby gates or sterilisers, etc. for little ones. And then it talks about the carer's absence. So what's in place when the parent or carer isn't there? Is there somebody else that's looking after the child or young person, such as a family member, a neighbour, a close friend? Do they know how to cross the road if they're starting to do that by themselves? What rules are in place in terms of curfews and how a child or young person might get home if we're thinking about older children and young people? And again, just that reminder that we're scoring from 1, which is good, and 5, which is not good. There are some detailed pages in the GCP2 handbook that helps you to think about what it is that you're looking for in these different areas. So I've just popped 2 up there on the screen, but like I said, you can find these in the GCP2 handbook. So if you can't find yours, grab it from the resource downloads, and it will really help you to think about What is it that you're looking for? What is it that you might want to ask about? What is it that you might want to think about or talk to parents or carers about in these different sections? Okay, so what do I mean by 1 to 5? So I've said that a couple of times that we scale from 1 to 5, and 1 is good and 5 is bad. So the scaling is in front of you there. When we think about 1, we're thinking about the child's needs are always met. The parent goes above and beyond for the child, and the child is always put first. When we think about a 2, we think about a child's needs being met, and the child is a priority. When we think about a 3, we think about most of the time the child's needs are met. So parents and carers and the child's needs are kind of on a par with each other, neither being above the other. And those essential needs are usually met for that child or young person. So that's where we would think about or use the term good enough parenting. When we think about 4s or 5s, they're the kind of lower end of that scale in terms of the care of the child. And 4s are thinking about most of the time the child's needs aren't met. So the parent's needs might be considered before the child, so therefore the child's need considered second, and their essential care needs are often not met for them. And then when we think about 5, which is that worst end of the scale, we're thinking about children's needs never being met. So children's essential care needs are not met at all. And this could be due to a number of factors. It could be exhaustion, or it could be the intentional disregard from parents and carers for the child or young person's needs. And that really needs to be kind of thought about when you're thinking about your reporting. What is it that makes this a 5? What evidence have I got? And is this intentional, or does the parent or carer honestly not know how to meet this need? But remember, when you're scoring, you're thinking about what care is being provided. When you're thinking about your report, that's when you're thinking about the why that care might be being provided or not provided in that way. Remember that when you're scoring your graded care profile 2, you're using that continuum of best to worst, which is your 1 to 5. Remember that the main way that you should be gathering your information is via observation. So you should be spending time with this family to look at, to observe kind of their normal daily life. What does this look like? How does this play out for this family? What are the dynamics and what is the care on offer for this child or young person? You can gather evidence in other ways through conversation with parents and carers or the child or young person in question or children or young people in question, and also from other professionals as well. But that information should be kind of dated, timed, and it should be of good quality and within the assessment period window. Now, I say assessment period window. What I mean by that is when you're doing a graded care 2 profile assessment, you need to pick a period of time to do it within. We're not taking into account stuff from 6 months ago, and it needs to have an end date. So what we would normally recommend is something between 6 to 8 weeks to complete your assessment, and therefore you're not taking into consideration lots of past information, and you've got a clear end date in sight when you've completed your assessment and you're able to write your report, and then you can put in your plan or make some decisions around what needs to happen next for this family. You should review the observation against the grades and kind of pick the closest number, but don't guess. So if you don't know something, if a piece of information is missing, if you've not observed something, if you've not been able to ask a question or that question hasn't been answered clearly enough for you, then don't guess the information, just leave that part blank. And remembering that anyone can complete and can score a GCP2 assessment, but what we would recommend is that it's done in partnership with other people that are working with those children and family. And also kind of cross-referenced and checked out with a line manager or colleagues that are working with that family, just to make sure that you're on the right page, that they've seen the same things that you have. And especially if it's your first time doing one of these, you might want to get somebody to kind of look it over and see how you're scoring and discuss why you've scored the thing that you have. So let's just go over how we should be scoring your GCP2 assessment. Remember to be objective. Whatever it is that you've observed, pick the closest grade or score to what it is that you're seeing. Really between the parent and carer and the child or young person. Multiple children within a family home, you can do one assessment for all those children. If you're seeing different care that's being offered to the children, or one child is having different care to the other children, then please think about whether you need to do a separate assessment based on the different care that those children are receiving. Thinking about parents and carers, whether they're living together or whether they're living apart. If their parenting is pretty much the same, you can do that in one assessment. If, however, their parenting is significantly different, you might want to think about doing more than one assessment, so one for each parent, to capture their parenting and the care that those children are receiving from each parent. If the child has a disability, you should have some understanding of what the care needs of that child is, in order to really be able to assess and score that parent or caregiver. If you don't understand what those care needs should be, please utilise that kind of team around the family in terms of the other professionals that are working with this child, young person, or family, as they should have some understanding within that mix as to what those care needs are, what they should look like, what good enough looks like, and actually whether that parent or caregiver is providing that good enough parenting for this child with additional needs or disabilities. So to recap, assessments should be completed during normal circumstances. Now, what I mean by this is if it's just coming up to Christmas and everything's a bit chaos, that's not a normal circumstance. If the family are going through a recent bereavement, that is probably not a normal circumstance time. However, be mindful that if that family's norm is chaos and chaotic, then please do continue to complete the assessment. Remember to use current information, not old information, and use those defined timescales. Note the input of other agencies, for example, housing, health, education. And note if the parent or carer is deliberately trying to mislead or give false information around the assessment. Remembering that the GCP2 does not cover everything, it's not exhaustive, so you might see things or have a particular concern that isn't documented as part of the assessment, but please do document that in your report that goes alongside the assessment. And in the development section of the Graded Care Profile 2 assessment, it's broken down into different age groups. Please use any relevant age groups. So even if you're supporting a 15-year-old, you can still use the age group that is 0 to 2 or 2 plus, etc., if it's relevant for that family or for that child or young person. Always score first and then interpret the information you've gathered as part of your report. So ensuring that you're scoring based on your observations and then using your report as a way to interpret and discuss the reasons behind your scoring, and therefore what might need to be put in place for this family. Okay, so let's recap how we score. So you've got your main areas there, so physical, safety, emotional and development, broken down into A, B, C and D. Each of those main areas has got those smaller areas, so that's that point 1 would be nutrition there under physical, point 2 would be housing, point 3 would be clothing. And then each of those, again, is broken down into really specific areas for you to focus on. So in this circumstance, they're looking at A, which is physical, 1, which is nutrition, and then 1 again, which is the quality of the food or drink that's on offer, the quality of that nutrition. This gives you an overview of the scoring handbook. So how it really breaks it down for you in that handbook in terms of what area you're scoring and what you would be expecting to see at those different score levels from 1 through to 5. So it really helps you focus your thinking around this. So how do we score? Let's have a look through. So if we're scoring between a 1 and a 3, so if we're scoring 1s, 2s or 3s, then we are thinking about what the most common score is when we're doing our end goal scoring. So if it was 1s and 3s, we're thinking about what is the most common number that comes up. If we're scoring 4s and 5s, they trump everything else, and we would then think about what the highest score then is at the end of that section. What do I mean? Let's break it down. So if we're looking at physical, which is what we've just looked at, and we're looking at A1, A1 is broken down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sections. So each of those sections would get a score, and then at the end of that, you would then put your kind of final score in the A1 box, if that makes sense. So as you can see, A1.1 is 2, A1.2 is 3, A1.3 is 3, A1.4 is 3, and A1.5 is 3. So you've got 1, 2, 3 2s and 2 3s. Now this scoring sheet says that then therefore your final score for that section is a 3. I would question that because you've got more 2s than you have 3s, so therefore it should be a 2. If you go all the way down to sub-area A4, which is hygiene, they've scored this as a 5 because there's only one box to score and that's a 5, so that's what your final score for that area will be. If you think about the health area, so that's A5, that is broken down into 4 sections. They've scored their 2 2s and 2 3s, and then their final score for that area they've put as a 3. Now there is no most common number because there's 2 2s and 2 3s, so in that circumstance we're going to go with the slightly higher number and say that our final score is a 3. This other sub area here in housing, that is broken down into 3 sections. So we've got a 4 and 2 3s. Therefore, the score for this would be the 4 because it is the highest number. Where we've got 4s or 5s, they trump all the other numbers in there. So that would be a 4. And then finally on this one, we've got the sub area around clothing, so that's A3, and that is broken into 3 different sections. They're all scored at a 3, so your most common number there is a 3, so therefore your answer or your score for that is a 3. Now, we also have to score the area overall. So if we can see there, we've got a 2, a 4, a 3, a 5 and a 3. Based on those sub-area scores, our overall area score would be a 5 because 5 is the highest number that we've got there. Even though we've got a 2 and a couple of 3s in there, the 5 trumps everything because then it tells us that there is a significant issue that needs to be addressed in the physical area. There we go. The overall score would be a 5. Now, I hope that's been helpful. This is just a little look at how that would look on your scoring sheet. So as you can see, it's scored across. So you've got those sub areas down the side, you've got then those kind of individual sections across, and you score each one. You then get your score at the end of each row, and you have then your final area score in that larger column then right at the end of the row. When you've completed your GCP2 assessment, you'll need to think about what level of neglect is present for this child or young person, and there's some guidance around this on page 19 of the GCP2 handbook. So you can use this guidance to help you think about what level of neglect is present for this child or family or young person, and as you can see, it's broken down in the same scoring way that we've been looking at all throughout, that 1 to 5, where 1 looks at no neglectful parenting, through to 5 where it talks about significant neglect for that child or young person. This then will help you make a decision as to what you need to do next with the information that you've got and what support or interventions might need to be put in place for this family. When thinking about your completed graded care 2 profile, there are just a few things you might need to take into account. You might take into account where there is a false positive. So this could be where you've used the tool in a family where there's more than one child or young person, and you've really kind of honed in on kind of one set of relationships that may actually be really positive. However, there may be relationships within that family home between parent and caregiver and a child or young person in that home that is more neglectful, that you may have missed on your encounters. We think about false negatives as well. Now, this could be, I mean, I said earlier about doing this in a normal time for a family. If you do this assessment in an abnormal time for the family, it could give you a false negative where we see a family in chaos, where the care isn't what we would expect it to be. But that's not the norm for that family. It's because something significant has happened, such as a bereavement or a recent loss of financial income, which means that the family are currently in a time of adaptation. We also need to think about parental risk factors. Although the scoring doesn't necessarily take this into account, we need to think about this when we're doing our report. So for example, is there or has there been domestic abuse within the home, substance abuse, learning difficulties that are making it more difficult for this parent to parent in a more positive way? Again, when we're thinking about our report, we're going to think about the history, any patterns or length of involvement, because although the information that we're scoring on is current, actually, if this family has been through services over and over again for a long period of time, we might need to think about what do we do differently this time to try and have some long-term sustainable change. And we might need to make particular note of unpredictable patterns of behaviour. So that would be things like that up and down parenting. 1 minute parenting is great, the next minute it is awful, and there's not really much in between. What is that like for that child or young person? And again, take consideration and account of that in any reports that you complete. So just moving on to thinking about adolescent neglect. So adolescent neglect can be really different to neglect in kind of younger children, because adolescents are at that point where they want some independence, they want to be going out and doing things. It's not as easy for parents or carers to almost make them do things as it is for younger children and young people. And we'll explore what I mean by that in a minute. So it can be really different and sometimes difficult to kind of assess and to think about. So let's just go through some points here. We need to think about empowerment versus safety and support. So that is encouraging children and young people to be individual, to learn new things, to do new things, to have experiences of their own, whilst also putting that safety and support in place for them. So encouraging them to take up activities that they've expressed an interest in, having boundaries in place in the home around expected behaviours. Or expected chores that we would like them to do. Things like curfew times and looking into how a child or young person is going to be getting home if they're out with their friends and what that looks like. Or even supervision while they're learning to cook. We need to think about support and commitment. And this is something that the GCP2 can help us to measure for adolescents. There are some areas of particular note when we're thinking about adolescent neglect, such as hygiene. So it's almost easy to pick up the 2-year-old and put them in the bath, to wipe the face of a little one, to do hand washing after the toilet if you're toilet training, etc. However, it's not as easy to make a 14-year-old have a bath or a shower, but we need to be making sure that that encouragement is there, that access to hygiene products is there, etc., to make sure that this young person is able to take care of their own hygiene. When we think about safety, again, for younger children, it might be things like safety gates, learning how to cross a road with them, holding hands in the street, that kind of thing. That would look, again, very different for adolescents. So safety for adolescents might be things like having safety plans with them, checking their mobile phones and having agreement with them about how that's going to be done, putting parental controls on electronic devices, making sure they know how to get home or how to contact somebody in an emergency. So safety for adolescents looks very different. And so does that emotional and developmental care. So again, with children or kind of younger children, there could be lots of play, reading stories together, kind of going out to the park together, that kind of thing. As children and young people get older, they don't want to interact with those things in the same way. So how are we continuing to have that emotional connection and have that relationship and support the development of that child, but of that young person? Are we having kind of family time where they're invited? Um, are we making sure that they know that if they're going through something tough, they can talk to us and we can support them through that? Are we offering guidance where things are a bit difficult? Are we asking them if they're okay if they come home and they just don't seem themselves? So what is it that's in place for those adolescents that really supports that emotional and developmental aspect that's different from when they were little? But just a reminder that the GCP2 doesn't measure the impact of these things, and it doesn't measure things like risk taking. Teenagers or adolescents, just by their very nature and their biology and their kind of brain workings at that point, means that they are more risky. They're more likely to take risks. They're more likely to kind of see what happens if they do something, say something, go somewhere that they shouldn't be doing, going to, or saying, etc. And it doesn't measure the impact of that. What it can do is help us to think about what is in place from the parent or caregiver around offering safety around these. And it can also facilitate those conversations with children or young people about what is it that's still their parent or caregiver's responsibility? What is it that we need to see from them to kind of increase these scores? What would they like to see to be different, and how do they think things can change? And really involving them in that conversation moving forward. There's also a guide that's available in this resource section of our website that's specifically for young adults or adolescents that talks about the GCP2. So again, it's something that you can utilise with kind of that age group that you might be working with, to look at what the GCP2 assessment is, what it does, why you're doing it, and to help support those conversations around what your scoring might be, what their scoring might be, and how they see things moving forward for their family. And just a bit of a reminder that through COVID pandemic, the NSPCC developed some parent tools. Now, the idea behind them was that you could give these or email these or post these to a parent or carer, and they could complete these themselves and score them themselves. We can still use them. They're still a great tool. They're still available again on this resource part of the website, and can really facilitate those conversations around, okay, you've scored a 3 and I've scored a 5. Now that's quite a big difference. What can you tell me that might change my mind? Or let's have a look at the evidence that I've got that means that things aren't actually where you think they are. And it can really help facilitate those kind of discussions and conversations where there's a difference of opinion between professionals and those kind of caregiver roles. And then just to recap on your report writing. So once the GCP2 assessment is completed, I've said a few times you'll need to do your report. There is a blank report template that we saw earlier that you can download to help you with that. That report should then be shared with the family along with your scoring for the assessment. For them to really understand what it is that you've seen, what it is that the scores are, and to then facilitate those conversations around what might happen next. This report and your assessment should then be added to the information on the child's file on EHM, so the Early Help module, which is that multi-agency recording space within the Early Help space in Sandwell. You can find that blank report form, as I've said, and the assessment in this resources section, but it's also built in to the Early Help module. So if you wanted to do it directly onto there, you can do, and it's also built into LCS as well, which is our Sandwell Children's Trust kind of recording space. There are also some examples on this resource space that you can find of kind of good reporting. So one is the example from the full day training that you will have undertaken, and there is another example on there as well of a good practice one from within Sandwell. So it's an adapted and anonymised one from one that was completed by a practitioner within Sandwell that you might find useful. So what other help and support is out there other than your full day training and this recorded session? You can also find all the resources that I've talked about in the resources section of the Safeguarding Children's website. So that's all your blank forms, all your guidance documents, those good practice examples, your parent leaflets in different languages, your adolescent leaflet, etc. It's all there. There's also a step-by-step practice guidance for completing the assessment on EHM, so the early help module, and on LCS within that resources area as well. So if you want to do it directly onto the system and you're not sure how, then those guides can talk you through it. But for additional support in terms of the early help module system, you can contact Izzy, and her email address is just there for you guys to copy over if you want it. And that's it. I hope that you feel a little bit more confident, that you've kind of had a bit of a refresher on how to score and how to use the Graded Care Profile 2 tool. If you've got any further questions, queries, concerns, or you'd like some support in completing your first Graded Care Profile 2 assessment, then please do let us know. You can contact us using the details at the bottom of the website. There's a contact us section, so please do use that to ask any questions, gain any guidance, or we may be able to put you in touch with somebody that is more experienced in completing Graded Care Profile 2 within your area of work that might be able to support you through completing your first 1, 2, 3, however many you need that support with as you go along. Thank you very much for watching.